Okay, let's get this show back on the road. We've got another terrific panel of people here. So we've sort of talked a little bit about the introduction of laws by states, particularly on behalf of children. And so now we've got a panel directly on that point, and we've got a great group of people here. To my right is Utah State Senator Mike McKell, traveled east just to join us today and impart his wisdom. He sponsored the first law that requires parental consent for children's access to social media sites. And next to him is Carl Sabo, General Counsel of NetChoice, who's been challenging these laws in court, left and right. And then down at the end, Professor Julia Mahoney, and she'll be giving us her perspective on the prospects for these laws. And finally, online is Robert Coles, who'll be filling us in on developments in the EU and the UK. And Robert, where are you? Are you London?
I'm actually in San Francisco today.
Okay, well, all right. So we're going to do the same thing that we did the last time and start off with a 3 to 4 minute introduction explanation of views and putting a stake in the ground. Let's start with Mike.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here. I did come out here all the way from Utah, and the reason I came out here is because I care deeply about this issue. This is an issue that Carl and I actually got to speak about at a national conference last year or the year before. And we, in the state of Utah, we have planted our stake in the ground, so to speak. And I did appreciate the introduction with Carl filing lawsuits. We did get an amended complaint just last week from NetChoice. I have it here. So I've got the state of Utah sued at least twice so far, and we're going to continue to persevere forward. So the question is, why do I care? Why do I care about this issue? Why do I care about social media? This is something that we've worked on a long time, and we have taken a different approach. I appreciated the panel before talking about the internet in general, but social media to me, and we'll get into it in the panel, but I have 4 kids. I work with youth in my community. Some of the big legislation I've worked with is troubled teen industry. You've probably seen some of that's gone national. I ran that legislation in Utah, and that has also gone national. But I really care about our kids. And right now we have a mental health crisis in America. One thing I did is I brought some experts to my last committee hearing, and a lot of the experts, we had the research assistant to Jonathan Haidt, New York University. We've got a video that we're going to play from the U.S. Surgeon General, and a lot of the data suggests that a lot of the problems are directly attributed to social media. So that's why I care. That's why we're in this fight. I have 4 kids. I've got 2 daughters, 2 sons, and I see the impact. I see the impact in schools. I see the impact in the suicide rate. And as a policymaker, it's just something that I'm willing to fight. Some interesting data of parents out there that think we should have parental consent. Pew Institute showed more than 80% of the parents think we ought to have some form of parental consent for social media. Ironically, 46% of the youth themselves think that there should be some parental control and some parental consent. With that, I look forward to the panel. Thank you for having me here today, and that's why I'm here, is because I truly do care about the issue.
Thank you, Senator. Carl?
Yeah, thanks for, I presume this is on, yes, no, cool, all right, let's rock and roll. So first of all, thanks for having me. It may sound like Senator McKell and I are going to like fight and fisticuffs and stuff, and we've known each other for well over a decade, except he's way more tan than I am. And I mean, you're living a great life. So like Senator McKell, this is ultimately about protecting kids, right? I'm a dad, I've got 2 kids, my wife's a child therapist, living in the era of social media, right? But I think it was Ms. Joyce from the last panel who said time is a flat circle, and it really is. So every generation, there's this new panic about, oh my gosh, this new technology has come out, it is ruining the children. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was violent video games. And then before that, it was rap music. We all remember Tipper Gore getting up before Congress and talking about it. Before that, it was cable television, Elvis Presley. And yet American and American parents continue to venture on. We take the technology, we adapt, we adopt, and we empower. And that's what we do time and time again. And in the same way that time is a flat circle, back in 2000, the state of California actually outlawed the sale of, quote, violent video games to minors. Made it illegal to sell, quote, violent video games to minors. Went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in a nearly unanimous decision written by Scalia, because we are here at the Antonin Scalia Law School, joined by several Democratic justices, including several that are still on the U.S. Supreme Court today. They all said, hey, guess what? That's violation of the First Amendment. It's violation of the First Amendment in two ways. One, it's a violation of the First Amendment rights of 18-year-olds and minors, people under the age of 18, to access speech. And two, it's a violation of the First Amendment from the speakers, the creators of the video game. So now fast forward to 2021, 2022, 2023, and 4. So we first see legislation and a law out of the state of California called the Age-Appropriate Design Code. Okay, one, when I mentioned to my wife that I was going to speak and discuss the issue of age-appropriate design code, she stops me, much in the same way that I, as an attorney, will stop her when she says something legally wrong. She will quickly stop me when I say something that is clinically incorrect. The term age-appropriate is not used by clinicians. It is developmentally appropriate, because age doesn't mean squat. We all know plenty of 10-year-olds who act like 18-year-olds, and we know a lot of 18-year-olds that act like 10-year-olds. Age is a crappy determining factor of maturity. So right off the bat, we knew age-appropriate was kind of hokey. Well, lo and behold, NetChoice brings a lawsuit against it. Turns out a law in America based on European guidance and statutes doesn't really care about the First Amendment too much, so we quickly got that one enjoined. Not to be outdone, Arkansas and Ohio take similar steps. Those both get enjoined. The state of Utah, once again, my friend, Senator McKell, creates a law. It gets enacted. NetChoice brings suit to stop it. The Utah legislature quickly runs back to the drawing board and rewrites and reintroduces new legislation that we'll also be talking about today. And as was noticed, NetChoice filed its amended complaint. So what are we for at NetChoice at the end of the day? One of the things that's often left out of all these discussions is one simple word: parents. 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 In fact, when I testified in Annapolis in a law that's hopefully going to get vetoed, the word parents appears but once in the 20-some-odd pages of legislative text. What we are constantly seeing is an attempt to supplant parents with government. At the end of the day, these laws that we are seeing across the country are saying to parents, you are incapable of parenting your kid. You are incapable of taking away a device. They are acting from the opinion and decision that tablets grow on trees and cell phones fall from the sky. Wrong. What I hope to see, and I will hand it over to you in a sec, what I hope to see is there is a role for government. Actually, Governor Cox of Utah actually does a really good job with this. They are leading a campaign to educate and empower parents, something we at NetChoice strongly believe in. We created the SHIELD campaign for that very purpose. So if you remember back in the day, the old PSAs of it's 11 o'clock, do you know where your children are? A role for government, rather than trying to replace parents, would be something as simple as saying, it's 11 p.m., do you know where your child's cell phone is? And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague.
All right, so since the subtitle of this, The Race to Regulate the Internet, is Should States or the Federal Government Set the Rules for Website Content, Child Protection, and Personal Data Control, I will start by discussing the roles of state and federal government in regulating the Internet. Because in thinking about regulation in this area, I think it is important to keep in mind that the state governments and the federal government have distinct, although in some important respects, of course, overlapping authority. The government powers of both state and federal government are strong, but of course not boundless. And the questions of precisely what the limits are on the power of state governments and the federal governments is, of course, a source of constant controversy. In particular, when it comes to regulating the internet, there are profound tensions, I think, between the bailiwick of the state governments and the role of the federal governments. Let me talk about that, I think, to give us a foundation for what promises to be a very interesting and spirited discussion. The state governments have the basic police powers: health, safety, and morals. Health and safety has been the province of the state governments since the founding of our nation. State government regulation of morals began to be more aggressive in the 19th century and continued to be fairly aggressive into the 20th century, with a bit of a step back as sexual mores changed. And that stepping back from morals regulation has had, many argue anyway, some very profound effects for the health of younger people in our society. If the kids were all right, if there were not serious concerns about mental health of minors right now, I think we'd be having very different debates. We would then, I think, take the view of Carl that, yeah, every generation there's some new moral panic. Sometimes it's pool, sometimes it's violent video games, sometimes it's Gilligan's Island, kids watching too much television, but really everything has always turned out okay. But in 2024, there are, I think, some very grave concerns about mental health problems among many who are many young people. And the state governments, with their basic police powers to regulate public health and safety, pretty much are on the front line of addressing issues along these lines. That is not to say that parental rights are not important. Of course they are. And I think that state governments are extremely respectful of the fact that in many situations, parents are recognized as being the very best decision makers for their children. But it has never been the case that state governments have said to parents, how you raise your kids is up to you. You don't want to educate them? Just fine. No, that is not what state governments say. You don't want to feed them. You don't want to feed them. You don't want to, in effect, supervise them. Absolutely not. This is, of course, a very tough area, because I think state governments, at least those who are sensitive to parental rights, I think that describes just about every state government official, certainly do not want to Bigfoot parents. But they also are attuned to the terrible, terrible consequences of potential parental neglect. Now, again, as I mentioned, state police powers, though broad, they're not limitless. What exactly are the limits of basic state police powers to ensure public health and safety? Well, for one thing, those powers are constrained by constitutional rights. For purposes of today's discussion, First Amendment rights of speech and assembly and association, and also religious freedom are, I think, especially important. Turning to the national government is entrusted with ensuring that we have a national marketplace, because one of Congress's most important powers is the power to regulate interstate and international commerce. One of the most important motivations for the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that hammered out the Constitution that we now live under was concern that a whole lot of different state regulation could, in effect, inhibit a flowing, vigorous national market, and that, in effect, states could enter into trade wars or just enact various sorts of protectionist or anti-competitive regulation. So having the national government, in effect, regulate in this area makes a great deal of sense from the perspective of Congress being responsible for ensuring a thriving national economy. There are big benefits, of course, to state regulation, too. The states can, of course, in effect, experiment. This phrase, the laboratory of the states, is an important one. We see that the states take different postures toward very difficult issues, and we can see what seems to be working and what doesn't. We also see that states, especially state legislatures, can often be quite adept at, in effect, taking into account particular desires, particular motivations, particular values of their state. And I think this is especially important in areas where there is a wide range of views, as there is in the United States today, about exactly at what point and in what ways minors should be exposed to sensitive material, particularly material that has some sort of sexual element. To be sure, there's downside to state regulation, and there are concerns, I think, that states will, in effect, pass a whole lot of different laws that will be very, very difficult for businesses to comply with. And that, of course, means that we can have a lot of businesses that might be profitable will end up not being profitable, not making it because they have these expenses of complying with a panoply of different state regulations. And that can ultimately, of course, lead to the inhibition of competition. For those who are concerned about major media companies, especially major social media companies, the idea that potential new entrants can be hamstrung by having to comply with a whole lot of different state laws, I think, is a danger that looms particularly wide. All right, but with federal government regulation, there are, I think, even greater concerns that the national government will partner with powerful corporate interests. Big government, and our federal government is inevitably going to be a very strong government. The United States Constitution, of course, provides for a very strong federal government. That big government partnering with large, powerful businesses, to many people, raises the specter of tyranny. All right, so I haven't solved anything, but I think that perhaps I have laid out some what has made.
Thanks, Julia. Robert?
Well, thank you for having me. I wanted to give you a bit of a perspective from the rest of the world. So I've worked for 35 odd years in some of the largest corporations in the world, companies like GlaxoSmithKline, National Grid, Merrill Lynch. The perspective I wanted to bring really was working outside of the US, where you operate in very many countries and from a practitioner perspective. So I'm not a lawyer. I've been a chief information security officer and sometimes chief privacy officer for some of those organizations. And I want to give you a couple of perspectives. The first was really around, practically working outside of the US and operating in many countries. When I was at GlaxoSmithKline, we operated in 110 countries. Tom made the point in his opening address this morning that every state and every country in the world is trying to regulate around this stuff. I can tell you, when you're working in 110 countries and across 50 or 52 states, understanding the complexity and the volume and the reach of all of the regulations is nigh on impossible. The second is, as things change, if you're not part of the debate around the change, when regulators look to consult on new regulations or legislators on new laws, if you're not part of the debate, then you can't get your perspective across. And if you're not living in a country, then it's almost impossible to be part of that debate. So just from a practical perspective, changes are imposed upon you. Sometimes the legislators or the regulators haven't really considered all angles of the debate. And in all these things, it's a balance. In relation to protection of children, there's a balance between protecting the vulnerable over privacy. The European Court of Human Rights has enshrined the right to a private life. In some respects, that contradicts directly our ability to protect children at the same time as protecting everyone else and giving them their privacy. The second point I really wanted to make really is about I suppose this is the cynic in me, the motivation of some of the regulators and the legislators outside of the US. So within the UK, we've got parliamentary elections coming up. Within the European Parliament, we've got parliamentary elections coming up. And we've had a flurry of legislation around protecting the vulnerable. The cynic in me says maybe that's because those are popular vote-getting sentiments, and and legislation around these aspects it will help to bolster up the incumbents in Parliament. The second point in motivation I wanted to make was that, there's a lot of money to be had in regulation. If you look at the fines that the Irish data protection regulator has recently issued on the likes of TikTok, Instagram, Amazon, it amounts, just those three, to more than €1 billion, which is getting on for 0.2% of the GDP for the Republic of Ireland. There's a lot of money to be made in regulation if you do it right. And the cynic in me says, perhaps the motivations for some of this regulation is more around the money rather than the protection and the balance between protecting the vulnerable and individual privacy.
Thank you, Robert. JP, before you ask a few questions, I want to lay a challenge down for this panel, because I've heard it in the first panel and I've heard it here a little bit. And that's the statement about time being a flat circle, and things happening each generation and happening again and again. Nothing's new. I've come to the conclusion that that is a short-sighted view of where we are, and I'll tell you why. I think it has an impact on solving these problems. And it was basically working on my book and thinking about these issues for a long time. And I think what we're missing is the scale of the issues. And what I mean by that is as follows. When I started in bank regulation in 1976, the most that you could steal from a bank was whatever you could put in 2 valises and shove it in a van and drive away, right? Maybe you could steal a few $100,000. Today, you can steal an unlimited amount of money online from just about anywhere you want to if you are a persistent threat and have the ability. So we're talking about a scale that is dramatically different in terms of what can be stolen. Well, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. I don't know how many of you read the book Tracers in the Dark, but it is a really spine-tingling discussion of how authorities in various countries, including the United States, brought down the Silk Road and then Welcome to Video. And the discussion about Welcome to Video is what I think underscores the difference in scale here. Welcome to Video was, for a number of years, the main purveyor of child sexual abuse material in the world. And it had videos of children as young as 1 year old, right? And you just think about that. And it took agents in the United States and with other countries 3 to 4 years to find 2 degenerates in an apartment in South Korea with 1 server with 250,000 videos on it. And every one of those agents involved in that investigation and that bring down for those 3 years needed psychological counseling because of what they saw. The scale of the problems have changed dramatically. That means the scale of the solutions has to change dramatically. And I said it a little while before in the first panel, we can't solve digital problems with analog solutions. It's just a different mindset, a different thinking. But if you think about the scale of all these problems, they have changed dramatically. And that's why I think it's different. I do think it's different. And in any event, Einstein proved that time can be bent. If you don't believe me, see the movie Interstellar. Go ahead, JP.
Sure. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Senator McKell, Carl, Julia, and Robert. Senator McKell, in 2022, Louisiana became the first state to enact an age verification law for access to adult content websites. In March 2023, Utah enacted the first state law to require parental consent for a child to open or maintain a social media account, which you were the chief sponsor of. Could you tell us how you became interested in the area and what led you to draft the bill? Then also, in May 2023, U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory expressing concerns about the effect of social media on children. Senator McKell has provided us a video of the U.S. Surgeon testifying before the Utah legislature. And Colin, could you please go ahead with the video?
This is really good, by the way. I'm always leery when I provide a video that it doesn't work, but this is really good. Let's go.
I'm U.S. Surgeon General.
This is always what I'm leery of.
Hello, I'm U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy. Last year, I released a Surgeon General's advisory on social media and youth mental health. Surgeon General advisories are reserved for significant public health challenges that require the nation's immediate awareness and action. And the issue of social media has become one of those public health challenges. Simply put, I am concerned that social media has now become one of the drivers of the youth mental health crisis. The time for half measures on this issue has passed. We need urgent, comprehensive action to protect our kids from the harms of social media. To my colleagues in Utah, I'm grateful you are taking up this critical issue today. And while as Surgeon General I cannot endorse any specific legislation, I'd like to share with you some key findings from my advisory as you begin your hearings. First, as you are aware, social media usage among young people is near universal. Yet the answer to the question most often posed to me by parents across the nation, is social media safe for my kids, is no. There is not sufficient evidence for us to say that social media is safe for our children. While social media may offer benefits to some, including an opportunity to connect with friends and to find communities of shared interests and experience, there's a growing body of research associating social media use with potential harms. Youth who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of depression and anxiety symptoms. This is deeply worrisome, as on average, teenagers spend 3.5 hours a day on social media. Second, social media may contribute to harm through several mechanisms. Too often, children on social media are exposed to extreme and inappropriate content that may be violent or sexual in nature. They are commonly exposed to bullying and harassment, and to a hypercharged environment of social comparison, which affects how they feel about themselves. It's concerning to me that nearly half of adolescents say using social media has made them feel worse about their body image. Additionally, excessive social media use can disrupt activities that are critical for healthy development, including physical activity, sleep, and in-person interactions. A third of adolescents stay up until midnight or later on weeknights on their devices, which is largely social media use. As I continue to speak with young people across the country, the three things they say to me most often about social media are, it makes them feel worse about themselves, it makes them feel worse about their relationships, but they can't get off it. It's important to remember that adolescents are at a unique phase of brain development where they are particularly susceptible to social comparison and social suggestion. Third, we have not done nearly enough to protect children over the nearly 2 decades that social media has been part of our lives. We can and must change that. My advisory outlines solutions policymakers can take, including developing age-appropriate health and safety standards, requiring higher standards for data privacy, and requiring social media companies to be transparent about the data they have regarding the health impact of their platforms on our children. Until now, the entire burden of managing social media's harms has fallen on the shoulders of young people and parents. That is unacceptable. It is past time that public health leaders and policymakers have their backs. I thank you for your attention to this important issue.
Thank you, Senator McCall, for providing the video and sharing. So can you please take us through how you became interested in the area and what led you to draft your bill? And then please describe the process of having it drafted, debated, and passed in Utah.
Thank you. And more than anything else, I just want to jump in back to the idea of time is a flat is a flat circle. And this issue is a big issue. It's a pressing issue. And I wanted you to see that from the U.S. Surgeon General. One of the things that we needed to do in the state of Utah is identify our compelling state interest. Why is the state of Utah acting? Why is it that Senator McKell from Utah is here? Because I want other states to act, and I think it's time for Congress to act as well. But there's some really startling data, and I'm going to just read the sources. This is data from 2010 to the present. Major depression among U.S. adolescents. We've got from 2010 to the present. We've got, and this is the U.S. National Survey on drug and use health. We've got a 145% increase for girls. We've got a 161% increase for boys. This next source is from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention of National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. Self-harm, which is significant, right? These are kids from the age of 10 to 14. These are young kids. Girls had an increase from 2010, 281%. Boys had an increase of 96%. Self-harm in the UK, we've talked about what's happening in Europe. I've got the source here as well. 178% increase for girls, 134% increase for boys. We jump to Canada, same time frame. This is the Canadian National Ambulatory Care Reporting System. These are emergency visits for self-harm. We had an increase for girls, 138%, 75% for boys. One of the things that was important for us as we passed the legislation, and I can get into it if we need to, is what was the compelling state interest for the state of Utah? How did we narrowly tailor our bill to meet that? And what we did is we relied upon experts. We had some of the leading experts in the world that came and testified in our committee hearing, including a statement from the U.S. Surgeon General. I don't know that there is a better expert than the U.S. Surgeon General, and that's one of the things that we really wanted to do, and we codified it, which is something that is unique. We actually made legislative findings in our legislation, and let me just run through them, and then I'll turn the time back to the panel. Some of the things that we identified first and foremost in our legislative findings were privacy concerns and data. We talk about social media. I don't like the word social media because it is a data mining operation. We talked about the product earlier. A panelist talked about the product was speech. It's not speech. It's mining your personal data. That's how they monetize. That's how they monetize the product. The product, again, is a data mining operation. They are monetizing your private information. That's how they make money, right? So we talk about the privacy concerns. The second thing we talk about in our bill is excessive use. Those are kids that lose their sleep pattern. They perform poorly in school, and the impact on overall health. The third thing we talk about is just the lack of tools for parents that have been created. We have these social media companies, and as we negotiated with them, they said, well, a lot of things we can do. And we can do all the things you're asking, but we don't want to have a competitive disadvantage with some of our other competitors, so we're just not going to do it. And I think that's troubling. The fourth thing we talk about in our legislative findings, we look at other regulated activities for minors, motor vehicles, medications, and products that we do regulate for minors today. The fifth thing that we found in our legislative finding was the mental health risks. And we backed that up with experts. We had experts that, Jonathan Haidt, New York University, his research assistant, also a PhD, came into our committee and actually testified with some of his data. The sixth thing we do is we just show that the efforts right now are just not working, and I think the data is really clear on that. And finally, we tied everything back to data protection. But as we looked at this issue, as we drafted the bill, we made it really clear. These are our findings, and then we can walk through the mechanics of the bill. I don't think it's necessary, but we directly tackle all of those addictive features. We directly tackle all that data harvesting of our minors, and that's what we did in the state of Utah to try to tackle this problem that is prolific and only getting worse. Thank you.
Mike, thanks for teeing up this problem and this issue for the panel. So, Carl, and before I throw the question to you and give you some equal time here, the book came out 2 weeks ago called The Means of Control by Byron Towle, who was a Wall Street Journal article. And like many of the journalists who got into specific areas, he was in this area in the journal and wrote this book, which is really terrific because it makes your point, Mike, about data being the product here, and social media just being the vehicle by which it is created and collected. And I think what most people don't understand about data collection is everything we do on a device, every movement we make is being collected. And it is attributable back to a person. It can be traced back to people, and Byron Tal goes to great lengths to show how that can occur. And so I think, Mike, your point is correct that we have to look at this through various different prisms. But with that said, Carl, why don't you talk a little bit about net choice and the view of net choice and content moderation and what they're doing in terms of some of these cases?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So NetChoice, we fight for free expression, free enterprise, pretty clear mission. I've been doing this job for over 13 years. I did not want to be running a law firm. I did law firm life. I did not want to do it again. But here we go, because unfortunately, we meet with state lawmakers, we meet with federal lawmakers all the time. We are constantly talking to them, trying to provide them good ideas that are constitutional, because an unconstitutional law protects 0 children. 2 years ago, Senator McKell and I sat next to each other at a conference. Senator McKell said, I've got this law. It's going to start protecting kids as soon as it takes effect. Never took effect. Why? Because it's unconstitutional. Same is true in California. Same is true in Missouri. Same is true in Ohio. Hundreds of hours spent with hearing from experts, talking to lawmakers, holding hearings. 0 children protected because of the laws that were passed, because they are unconstitutional. 0 children protected. Instead, we regularly work with lawmakers on laws that do comply with the Constitution. Now, I'm glad we talked about privacy, because that's what I teach here at George Mason Antonin Scalia Law School. Summer classes start on Wednesday, so feel free to sign up, Law 497. It's a fantastic class. And if you don't like me, I've got a co-professor, and he's way better. But why did I bring up privacy? Well, yeah, guess what? Social media platforms do collect a lot of data, and they show you ads based on what you're interested in. As a dad, I wish my kids got personalized ads when they watch TV. My son loves ESPN. Every morning he starts the day with SportsCenter. But you know what 3 ads he's constantly bombarded with? Alcohol, gambling, and men's physical health problem fixers. I would say all of which are wildly inappropriate for a minor, all of which are wildly inappropriate for a child. Instead, I wish he got personalized ads about, hey, there's a new Spy Kids book coming out in November. You should check it out. That would be great. That's done by data mining. Now, I'm glad we also brought up privacy, because it turns out the legislation that we fight against are some of the most privacy invasive pieces of legislation ever enacted here in the US. And why do I say that? So if you look at the way the laws are written, let's pick on the great state of California, so that way I can move off Utah for a minute. Okay, so it applies, just like Utah, to anyone under the age of 18. So it immediately tells platforms with strict liability standards, if under the age of 18, you must X. Most of us are like, oh, that's cool. I'm well over 18. That's not going to apply to me. Wrong. Wrong. Because what's the old adage on the internet? No one knows you're a dog. Well, the same is true with age verification requirements on the internet. We're not talking about the, what year were you born, check the box and go past it. Well, I was born in 1927, give me the web page. No, we are talking about strict liability. So the platforms have to have perfect information that you are who you say you are, regardless of your age. So much in the same way that if you want to buy a package of cigarettes, they don't look at you and say, oh, you look like you're over 18. They check your ID. We're talking about the same thing on social media. And we're not talking a one-off. We're talking every single time, because guess what? Username and password doesn't work. Netflix will tell you people share them. So that's what I mean by the most privacy invasive. This isn't just Carl pontificating. In one of the preliminary injunctions we secured, the judge in their decision stated that the desire to protect children collides directly with the state's compelled desire to protect the privacy of children and actually every other citizen in their state. So it is not bombastic for me to say what we are talking about is something called ID for the internet. And I don't even know how you make it doable, because it's not as though you can log in and walk away. Because, useful example from my life. My wife and son were on Amazon.com putting stuff into a birthday wish list. She gets up to go to the bathroom. Now my son is the driver of the computer. These systems, under these laws, would have to switch on a dime. So what, we just have cameras on all the time on us? These are the questions that were being asked. I haven't even gotten to the First Amendment, which we haven't yet mentioned. We talk about compelling state interest. Yes, there are lots of compelling state interests. But that's also why we have the Bill of Rights. Because they say you can have a compelling state interest. There's a lot the state wants to do. They want to do a whole heck of a lot. But that's where the First Amendment comes in and says, thou shalt not, thou may not, you may not government. And so in that, that's how we have secured our injunctions. Because are there less restrictive alternatives? You betcha there are. One of the things that we were just talking about, massive data collection. Well, you know who's not covered by the Utah law? Disney Plus. You know who's not covered by the Utah law? The Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Newspapers. They do massive data collection just like a social media platform would. Disney Plus, massive data collection, just like a social media platform would. So if the question is we're trying to protect the privacy, you don't in twofold. Once again, we're trying to protect them from seeing objectionable content. Well, guess what? You can go to pick up the newspaper or go read the NewYorkTimes.com and see some really horrific stuff emanating from wars all over the world. Yet, you could not get the same news at Facebook.com if you're a 17-year-old in the state of Utah without parental consent. The laws just don't make sense. So we've missed two things. One, protecting privacy. Two, the First Amendment. Okay, let me add on one more component. What about the role for parents? That is the thing that is fundamentally missing. That's one of the things that I am constantly working on all the time at NetChoice. Because parents have the role, not a role, they have the role. And the argument is, oh, parents, they're too dumb. Parents, we're too weak. We can't do it. Let's have Facebook raise our kids. We'll put them in charge. Mark Zuckerberg is not America's dad. I'm my kid's dad. And what I think is appropriate for my kids, I promise you, is going to be wildly different from many other parents, even in my own neighborhood. So why are we going to assume somebody sitting in Silicon Valley or somebody sitting in the state capitol knows better for me what is best for my kids? And that's the thing that needs to change. Now, one other component that hasn't even been mentioned, even by the Surgeon General, kids are depressed. Heck, yeah, they are. My boss is literally on his way to his daughter's graduation, which has been canceled. Her high school graduation was also canceled. Why was her high school graduation canceled? Why are levels of mental health so much higher in the past couple of years than they were 5 years ago? Is social media a factor? I bet it probably is. You know what's a bigger factor? COVID. And you know, once again, getting back to my colleague from the UK who's now in San Francisco, who has a political interest of shifting blame away from government overreaction to COVID? I can tell you the US Surgeon General certainly has that political interest. So before we go around saying social media is the but-for cause of mental health problems, we need to take a hard look at the struggles that our kids are facing. Because if we assume that, oh, let's get rid of social media, that'll solve our problems, that's a crime against children. Because we need to help children, we need to help parents, and that is the role of government, not telling us what speech is or is not allowed. So yes, lots to unpack, but as you can tell, I get very passionate because I deal with this in my own home. Like, this is a tough issue. And every time somebody says parents are too dumb, you're telling parents you are too weak. When your kid says they want that iPad or iPhone, you should just let them have it, because it's really not your fault. No, I'm a parent. I need to take the phone away. If my kids are on a phone late at night, I take it away, just in the same way I would take away TV, just in the same way that if they're going into the pantry and eating a whole bag of Nabisco Oreos, I would take that away and we'd have a talking. Why are we not doing the same thing with social media? So, sorry, that was Carl rant, but I certainly got my time back.
Thanks. Before I go on to the next question for Julia, if you, Carl, or someone, so you raised the example of the vineyard where it asks if you're 21 and you click and you're allowed entrance, and then you raised the Utah law and some of the other ones. Where on this continuum do some of the gambling sites like Sports Kings fall, or DraftKings? So you have to be 21 to enter, but how tight are they?
I mean, so one of the things that a lot of those sites do is they are heavily regulated. Because remember, this is the false analogy that always comes up. It's like, well, we regulate cigarettes and alcohol based on age, but you can't regulate speech based on age. One of the fundamental that's exactly what they tried to do in California back in 2000, way back in the day. Back in 2000 with video games. Free speech applies, it does not matter age. Second thing is, if you think about movies, the Motion Picture Association, I sometimes hear this. They're like, well, a 15-year-old can't go into an R-rated movie. They absolutely could. There is no law that says that the theater can't show that to them. There is no law that even says that movie must be rated R or PG or G. I used to work at the Motion Picture Association. They're the ones who do the rating. That is industry self-reg up and down the chain because the government cannot do it. So when you were asking about gambling is heavily regulated because it is not free speech. And they do that through geolocation. They do that through licensing regimes sometimes. I think they're kind of overly prescriptive with some of the licensing regimes, but that's a different discussion. But that's the fundamental difference because some people use false examples of gambling, alcohol, cigarettes, driving a car. You have no constitutional right to drive a car. You do have a constitutional right to speak and read.
Thank you. Julia, as a scholar in the area, you probably have quite a few thoughts on the issues raised by the Texas and Florida cases discussed this morning on the first panel. Can you please provide your thoughts on issues such as what constitutes state action, under what circumstances is it plausible for actions of big tech companies and other private entities to be deemed state action, and are there arguments that content curation by social media companies amount to action rather than speech persuasive?
Yes, thank you. Of course, we have lots of thoughts. In terms of state action, that is...
Here, take mine,
Thank you. In terms of state action, that's one of the toughest issues in all of constitutional law. Normally, of course, it's pretty easy to tell whether or not the government is acting in such a way that a constitutional right may be violated. And with rare exceptions, the constitutional rights guaranteed to us by our Constitution are guaranteed against government. But can the government do indirectly what it can't do directly? The answer is no. Of course, the government cannot commandeer social media companies to do things that the government would not itself be permitted to do. And that is exactly what at least some have accused the federal government of doing, of, in essence, commandeering the social media companies to accomplish things that the government, in effect, censorship, curatorship, if you want to put it a little bit less baldly, of viewpoints, of ideas that the government would like to have de-emphasized. But where's the line? At what point does the government alert of a company that there might be some stuff on social media that isn't quite accurate? We want to help you out here. We're all on the same team. We want the public to get timely, accurate information. At what point does that become government pressure or even government coercion? Those are very difficult terms to define. And I think there is not ever going to be a super bright line. As for questions about whether the content curation of social media companies and other entities can be called action rather than speech, another really difficult question, because as we discussed at the time of the first panel covered the fact that for purposes of Section 230, social media companies argue that curation is not speech. But for purposes of the First Amendment, curating content is often said to be a form of speech. Can they really thread the needle so finely? Possibly, is my response. There's a lot of stuff that we might say is, in effect, brand building, a lot of curation of content that we might think of as being somewhat akin to speech. But again, it's going to be very, very difficult to draw any kind of clear and bright lines.
Thank you.
So, Carl, and Mike, I guess I am delighted to see such zealous advocates on both sides of this issue. Passionate.
I haven't even got started yet.
Yeah, no, I know. I don't think either of you have gotten started yet. I think we're just scratching the surface here. I think we should probably culminate this with some sort of mud wrestling. But, Carl, I want to go back and dive into this a little more deeply in terms of the litigation you've brought in Utah and the arguments you've made, and give you a little bit of time to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, a quick fun fact, the government coercion component, the Solicitor General we just saw is the same Solicitor General being sued by the state of Missouri. That is Solicitor General Murty, and that is actually being joined by the state of Utah. So it's funny how everything kind of friends become enemies and enemies become friends based on it. Okay, so let's kind of dive into the new Utah state law. We'll be talking about Senator McKell's updated SB 194 for those of you playing at home. Once again, we mentioned that NetChoice filed suit against the original Utah legislation that we were assured was completely constitutional, and we welcome seeing you in court. We said challenge.
We still do.
We said challenge accepted. And as soon as we brought the suit, the state legislature quickly ran back to the drafting board and said, okay, wait, maybe that law was not ready for prime time. So they came out with the new Senate Bill 194. So in it requires things such as a social media site shall limit the ability of users to share content. Some might call that censorship. Restrict visibility. Some might call that censorship. Disable search indexing of users. I don't know how I find somebody if I can't search for them. I mean, for John, you might remember ICQ from back in the day where you had to share your like 8-digit code to find each other. I guess maybe that's how you do it. Okay, disabling autoplay and scrolling, but only for social media websites. So if you have autoplay on Disney Plus, you are good to go because that's perfectly fine. We decide that that's not at all compelling you to watch the next episode, but is somehow insidious when it comes to social media. We call that publisher-based discrimination. Disabling push notifications. That's one of my favorites. So let me give you an example. You may not receive push notifications if you're under the age of 18 from a social media platform. You know what? That sounds like a great idea. How about, here's a good use of social media push notifications. GMU Law School just had a power outage. Classes are canceled. Friends are sharing that on Twitter or Facebook. Might be useful before you board the train to go to school. Nope, you wouldn't receive that information. So let's see, what else do we have? Oh, here you go. You must provide age assurance with, quote, 95% accuracy. Once again, we're operating in the universe of strict scrutiny. Why 95? Why not 94? Why not 96? You can't just pull numbers out of thin air. They have to have some sort of complete basis to even begin achieving the level of strict scrutiny. So these are just part of our pleadings. Let's see, coupled with the point that I made earlier that a 14-year-old can see objectionable content on a NewYorkTimes.com website or a Salt Lake Tribune website, but they cannot see it on the same content on Facebook.com. Speaker-based discrimination. The goal is to protect minors, but the problem is we're like, well, this is okay, but this isn't okay. This speech is allowed, but this speech isn't allowed. And that's like basic law school 101, constitutional law type violation. It's been shot down time and time and time and time and time and time again. That's why NetChoice keeps winning these injunctions. Remember, you have to have a likelihood of winning on the merits, assuming all the facts on the other side are compelling. So we win the preliminary injunctions in every single state we bring our action. We don't want to have to get here. And that's why we really want to work with lawmakers on something that is ultimately constitutional. Unfortunately, as much as I love Senator McKell and as a friend, as a colleague, like, once again, I'm sorry, but your law just didn't get there.
All right, that is a lot to unpack, and let me just start with the constitutionality. So far, the rule in Utah, the law in Utah, has not been declared unconstitutional. I'm a marathon runner. Let me tell you my favorite marathon. It's the New York City Marathon. And to start the marathon, you actually take a boat to Staten Island. And when you get to Staten Island, you take a march to the starting line. When you get to the starting line, you're right in front of the Verrazano Bridge. And the very first part of the marathon, there's two columns of runners that actually run over the Verrazano Bridge. You've got Black Hawk helicopters in the sky. You've got the Statue of Liberty out there to the left, and then it rolls through Brooklyn. It rolls through Queens. Before you even hit Long Island, you've got to go over the Queensboro Bridge, and it finishes in Central Park. We're really early, and I'll tell you what's cool about these laws. In the state of Utah, we're going to fight it. I know Carl and I, we joke about it, but we're going to continue to fight it. And being enjoined doesn't scare the state of Utah, doesn't scare the legislature, because we're going to keep fighting. The cool thing is there's a lot of states that are doing very, very similar bills to the state of Utah. So I look at it, look, we've gotten over the Verrazano Bridge. We're probably rolling through Brooklyn right now, and we've got a long ways before we say this is unconstitutional. Let me tell you one thing that always bothers me, and this is what got Carl in trouble at our NCSL conference with another presenter. I don't think blaming parents is appropriate. Okay, and let me tell you what parents think. You've got the Pew Institute says 81% of parents think having some parental consent for social media would be a good idea. And why is that? And it's because parents understand that there is a serious problem, and a lot of parents aren't tackling it. And the reason why is because parents don't understand social media as well as their kids. They didn't grow up with it. I didn't grow up with it. I am confident that my children are much better with social media. The other issue that I always take issue with is when we blame COVID as if this is somehow some new mental health crisis. And that's why I shared with you the data. And the data I shared with you dates back to 2010. This is a crisis that started at the same time social media happened. And it's only getting worse, and it's very, very significant for our girls. And let me tell you what I tell lawmakers, and this is the concern, and this is why we don't work with, and this is not to be offensive, this is why we don't work with Net Choice or other players. The state of California was kind of load into this idea that we're going to work on age-appropriate design, and we're going to work with industry, and they did. And the lawmakers in California, they worked with industry, they worked with Meta directly, and then they got sued. State of Utah, we worked with Meta, we worked with all of the players, and then we got sued. Thankfully for us, one thing we told Meta, one of the things we told the tech companies is, look, we're going to pass a bill, and what we did is we had a delayed implementation date beyond the next legislative session, and we said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to open up bill files, we're going to work with you all summer long, and then we're going to run another bill the next session. So there was no reaction to a lawsuit because we actually had bill files that were already open. I think the lawsuit was a gift to the state of Utah because then we got to put our heads together. We had already come up with some really good language moving forward to resolve some of those concerns, but we had an opportunity to look at this lawsuit and say, okay, now we've got a lawsuit. This is what it looks like. And a lot of the legal advice we got is, parental consent is still a valuable element. We moved forward, but it wasn't something we reacted to because it's something we always said we were going to do. And as far as the litigation, I know the question is, have you seen interest from other states? I know that's one of the questions. There's a lot of interest from other states, and I hope we continue to see that. But I'll be quiet now. I'll go back to you here.
Carl, so are you going to fight this state by state? I know you've got litigation in Arkansas, Ohio, Florida. I mean, how does this play out for you in terms of all these states? Because we know one of the things they teach us as lawyers is the Supreme Court's probably going to look for a narrow way to decide these cases. So a decision on one case may not decide them all.
Yeah, so that's the difference you're kind of seeing up here is I'm arguing law. Senator McKell, rightfully, as politicians arguing politics, right? He's like, well, parents really, really, really want this. I'm a parent. Yeah, it would be great if I didn't have to do anything. But as a parent, I don't think that's my role. But that's a political discussion. From a legal discussion, which is where I've been kind of couching most of my discussion, is in First Amendment jurisprudence and what can a state do. As much as you really, 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 really want to end run the First Amendment, you can't. There's no maybe we can do this clever jujitsu magic trick. There's no David Copperfield here. The First Amendment's pretty clear on this. So what are we starting to see? What is the end game? We're actually starting to see, even though some lawmakers want to pursue bad ideas, we're seeing a lot more lawmakers reject them. We see states across the country rejecting these bills, rejecting these approaches. Guess what? A bill can get introduced. There are 10,000. I mean, I see Chris in the back the room. He and I have the scars to prove it. There are over 10,000 bills plus introduced every single year. The state of New Hampshire has 450 state lawmakers alone. So yeah, a lot of bills will get introduced. A lot of them are really bad ideas. A lot of them are really unconstitutional ideas, and an overwhelming majority of them never come to fruition. And what are we starting to see? We're starting to see a lot of lawmakers actually begin reaching out to groups like mine, like NetChoice, and say, wait a minute. This is lost in all these states. What can we do differently? And I'm not going to just say it's only NetChoice here. So our suit in the state of Utah is filed alongside FIRE, the Foundation of Individual Rights and Expression. That's the group that goes around and protects free speech on campus, not the type that you've been seeing recently in the news, but a lot of the blackballing of conservative speakers across the country. Who else filed amicus briefs with NetChoice in the state, in our state case against this California in the Ninth Circuit? New York Times, Washington Post, the AP, the Hearst publications. Why? Because it's the First Amendment. So this is not just NetChoice and Carl running around saying First Amendment. No, this is free speech advocates across the coast, across ideological ideals, solidifying behind the protection of free speech and against government censorship. So yes, politicians getting out there and saying, don't worry, parents, we have a silver bullet to solve your problems. And I wish it were so. I fundamentally do not believe it, and legally it can't be. But that's where we land, and that's the end game, is we're starting to see states across the country try to figure out, well, that didn't work, let's try something else. So they recognize what tried before doesn't work. And more are saying, you know what, this entire approach is a bad idea. And just like, the story of the Pied Piper, just leading somebody somewhere doesn't always end well.
Thank you, Carl. Julie, how do you evaluate the legal arguments on whether state social media parental consent laws are okay?
I would say very carefully. That's what courts will do, very carefully. We start out with the idea that basic health and safety regulations are looked at by courts with a pretty deferential standard because they trust state legislatures to do what is best for the people. I'm not saying that there's no scrutiny whatsoever. There does have to be, generally speaking anyway, some kind of means and connection. Where there are constitutional rights involved, including, of course, crucial First Amendment rights of media companies and other businesses to speak, and rights of minors to listen, then the level of oversight that courts apply gets higher, often quite high. In this area, there is no real dispute that states have a substantial, even a compelling interest in the health and flourishing of youth. Where things get difficult is in determining how tight that means-end connection has to be when it comes to these various regulations that states have passed. And frankly, a lot of these state bills have done themselves no favor by being something of a hodgepodge of measures, many of which are only tangentially connected, or at least not clearly connected to the very difficult and very important project of of ensuring the health of youth. So I think going forward, we will see more thoughtful and more careful drafting of legislation by state legislatures. I also think that we will see, and this is a good thing, more consultation with experts, including NetChoice and other industry groups, and that we will eventually, I hope anyway, arrive at a point where state legislatures do continue to legislate so as to attempt to pursue the health and safety of youth. As has been mentioned, there are a lot of reasons to think that things have changed and that the exposure to the internet has had some very detrimental effects on a lot of minors. And I believe that state legislatures can pursue their traditional role of basic police powers, protecting the health and safety of youth, without running into constitutional difficulties. But in defense of the state legislatures that end up drafting laws that end up being found not to be constitutional in all respects, First Amendment doctrine is something of a mess. It's often not so clear. I mean, you're absolutely right, Carl, that sometimes there are instances where one can look at a provision and say, this really is very unlikely to pass judicial muster. But there's a lot of areas that I think need a great deal of doctrinal development, and I hope very much that in the next couple of years we will see that, in particular with some of the current controversies. I think as records get developed better, I think we will actually see some clarification of crucial First Amendment doctrine.
Thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Julia. Robert, we all know that the EU and the UK, but particularly the EU, has been out in front of issues like privacy with the GDPR in 2016. The EU has just passed the Digital Services Act in 2022. How is this issue of child protection playing out across the pond, and where do you see this going?
Sure. So I guess the General Data Protection Regulation from 2016 was the first one that really tried to do something in this space. I'm not sure how successful that has been, really. So that was really the GDPR is really about the protection of personal data. So it enshrined a right that individuals have a right to control their own data, and that anybody that processed that data had to have consent to process the data and consent for how they use that data. So that drove all of the. If you've ever used a European website, you get a cookie that comes up and says, do you really consent to using this data in this way? And you have a choice. You can either accept and say, yes, I consent to use it, or you can say no, in which case then you can't use that particular website. So we've all just been, over the last 8 years, we've all just been conditioned to pressing yes all the time, because otherwise the internet would be unusable and we'd just be pressing no because we disagreed with how our personal data was being used, and we wouldn't be able to use the internet. So we've been conditioned to saying yes, but then in relation to minors, and again, that's a difficult discussion around what is a minor. A minor, the age of being a minor is different in different European countries. So in some countries it's 13, all the way up to 16 years old. But the GDPR says that if you're a minor, then you're not capable of giving consent to how you use your data. And therefore, those in a parental capacity must give it instead. So we've got this particular ridiculous situation whereby those in a parental capacity are completely conditioned to saying yes all the time to everything, and yet they're the ones that also have to say yes to the use of minors' data. So that doesn't really work, I don't think. The second is a bit more recent. So the Digital Services Act came in 22, and that covers information society service, which is pretty broad. That means any service provided at a distance, usually for remuneration by electronic means. So that's pretty much anything that's on the internet. It's a tiered law. So it says for the very large online platforms and the very large online security engines, then all of the provisions apply, and then it's tiered in such a way that, if you're a small local cricket club, then most of the provisions don't really apply to you. It's got good intentions. It aims to build a safer and fairer online world and protect users in the European Union in relation to anything illegal. So illegal goods, illegal content, illegal services. And for the first time, it really makes platforms legally accountable for the content of what they're serving up. If you think about some of the organizations that will be regulated under this act, it's organizations like Amazon, Facebook, Google Maps, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, Bing. I mean, it's the whole range. So this is the European Union trying to regulate at a distance all these massive online organizations. It's got some pretty good objectives. It requires a simple way to report illegal content. It requires that illegal content to be removed once it's been verified that it is illegal. It has some detail around advertising, and it has some specific requirements for children. For minors, there's a requirement that minors cannot be targeted for adverts using their profile, so using the personal data that's held about them. The issue with that is it also says that the platform or the service provider mustn't collect more information than they already collect, and therefore there's a difficulty in how does the platform know whether the individual is a minor or not. And then the second provision is around the privacy, safety, and security of minors that use that service. And in particular, it says that there needs to be a risk assessment to understand how minors can be exposed through the service to content that may impair their health, their physical and mental, or their moral development. And particularly when you get into moral development, that's very ambiguous and very difficult to define. And I think really just watch this space about how this develops and how it pans out. Penalties are pretty severe, fines of up to 60% of global revenue. Amazon global revenue is about 500 billion. So, potentially the EU could be fining Amazon, $30 billion for an egregious breach of this particular act. I think really, watch this space as to how it develops. I don't think we've got it any better than you have in the US at the moment. It's a developing space.
I thank you, Robert. So I'm going to ask you two other really quick questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience, including online,
Sure.
and then closing comments from everyone. If you could, Robert, if you could please comment on the Online Safety Act from the UK, and then also any potential regulation or considerations for TikTok.
So the Online Safety Act, that's very recent, that's 23. That's a law that requires, it's similar to the European law in that it makes the platform provider legally responsible for preventing the serving up of illegal material. So it's a bit controversial because it requires platforms to be able to scan, for example, encrypted messages for example, child pornography, which is merely illegal. So it's requiring the platform not to deliver illegal content, and it's requiring the platform to be able to identify illegal content. That's pretty controversial. So the likes of WhatsApp have said, if this is enforced, that would mean reducing the encryption requirements, for all of their users on their platform. I think WhatsApp, about 2% of their users are UK based. So they're saying that if we were to undertake this and to be able to scan, these messages, which we say is end-to-end encrypted, that we can't inspect, and that we give that guarantee of privacy to the user of that platform. If we're to apply this, then we have to reduce the level of encryption so that those messages are no longer private and secret to you, so that we can scan them for illegal content, which is very controversial. And they've said actually, if this does, really, if this is a requirement which gets enforced, then they might have to consider withdrawing from the UK. which I think would be a real shame for all the UK users. It's developed a little bit because originally the bill was going to cover legal but harmful material, which is really difficult to define. And that would have opened up a whole range of censorship. I mean, Carl was talking about censorship in the US, and if the UK government could define something that is legal but harmful, and then enforce a regulator to go and search for it and prevent it from being served up to children, that opens up a whole load of controversial issues around censorship. Yeah. So I mean, I think your second question was around TikTok. The TikTok must be just suffering at the moment. So they were fined 345 million last year by the data protection regulator in Ireland for not setting up privacy settings by default for children. This year there are 2 EU investigations going on with TikTok. The first is that it introduces potentially addictive features in its new TikTok Lite app. And they say that it's introduced features to try and get children to come back and incentivize them to keep coming back and using it, and therefore become addicted to the service. And the second investigation is around the lack of effective age verification protections. So, we've talked about, for the US and the other panelists have also talked about the difficulty around age verification. There are no really, really good age verification mechanisms other than, having a legally, producing a legally valid country-specific ID or perhaps taking a photograph and comparing that against a passport and the like. All of those require collection and storage of extra personal information, which in and of itself then means that those platforms are going to be an increased target for attack because they're storing more personal information. So I think TikTok must be really under pressure at the moment, especially given the fact the Chinese may have to sell and or pull out of America.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you all for the wonderful discussion. Are there any questions from you all, or Peng, do you have any from online? Oh, John, please. Thank you.
Sure. Let me just briefly ask the panel about kind of an issue that hasn't really been discussed yet, and without asking you to discuss the potential merits or lack of merits of the Dormant Commerce Clause, just as a very practical matter. Let's say that the Utah law is upheld, but let's say that a neighboring state passes an identical law with one specific change. The Utah law allows a non-custodial parent to give consent. Let's say that the neighboring state prohibits a non-custodial parent from giving consent. So that's one hypothetical. Let me make another hypothetical. The Utah law prevents a 17-year-old from accessing content without parental permission. Let's assume that a different neighboring state recognizes that every court that has ever looked at it has decided that 17-year-olds have the same constitutional rights as 18-year-olds. And so let's assume that that neighboring state passes a law that prohibits the platform from requiring parental consent for a 17-year-old. And then let's assume that you got divorced parents who happen to live in those competing states. What is a company meant to do with this, and what should a court do with the conflict that's set here?
That's a fantastic question.
Love that question.
I'd say the short answer to that question is that a panoply of state laws in tension or outright conflict, which we may well see, puts enormous pressure on Congress to act. And I am confident that that would be the outcome, eventually.
And let me respond to that. I actually love that question. I'm just going to clarify. Our parental consent is only if you're going to collect the data of a minor. Our bill deals with minors, but the only time we require parental assurance is this parental consent is if it deals with a deals with data collection. But I love the question, and when I talk to lawmakers across the country, and I think lawmakers have an appetite to run more legislation, not less. I actually hope we see that, and I hope we see that in a perfect solution for me. I'd want to see 50 states with 50 different bills with a constitution analysis where they worked with every constitutional scholar in their state and came up with a different solution, because I agree with Julia, it would force Congress to act. That is the best solution. So for me, the more states that do different bills, I think it's a good thing from my perspective.
So I'm going to be the lone conservative up here, I guess, saying I don't want more government. I want less government. But to answer the question, so we're actually seeing these collisions already occur. So the prior panel was all about Florida and Texas, whose laws actually require social media platforms to keep up lawful but awful content, let's say pro-terrorist speech, and truly vitriolic content that most states would consider not age appropriate for somebody under the age of 18. So we are already seeing these collisions where you actually have, as I said in the last panel, a mandate and a prohibition from removing otherwise objectionable content that most would deem inappropriate for minors. With the parent question, this actually, quick anecdote. So the state of Missouri in our lawsuit actually brought in a witness from the UK because the law works so well in the UK. They're like, oh, it works in the UK. We'll have a witness from the UK fly in and be our witness, the state of Missouri says, and that will show the judge how simple and non-controversial our case is. And so one of the questions posed to the witness for the state from the UK was, well, what about this parental verification thing? He's like, oh, we don't even try that in Europe. In the UK. That would be impossible because exactly the issue you raised. How do you do parental verification? It is really, 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 really hard to do it even in the real world. So you can't do it based on last name, a lot of Smiths out there. You can't do it based on birth certificate because, as you point out, families get divorced, kids get put up for adoption. One of my colleagues that I work for actually was in a foster home for a better part of his life, so I don't know where you go for that. And then finally, I will give you an anecdote from my own offline life where a situation where the father was deployed, the mother went AWOL, and so the grandparents became the de facto guardians, but not the legal guardians. So even in the real world, we suffer these problems. So it actually turned out really badly for the state of Missouri, as their own witness says, oh yeah, this law can't be complied with.
Robert, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, we've tried these things. I mean, I said earlier that GDPR, the only mechanism for working out parental consent in that case is another cookie with another, press here to say yes, and the parents are already immune to that, and they already click yes to everything anyway. And then you've got the complexity across Europe of the different ages for parental consent. So 13 in some countries, 14, 15 and 16 in other countries. So as a provider, to be able to work out the complexity around all of that is really difficult. I have to say the French are trialing something which looks promising. They've coming up with a sort of an identity broker and parental consent broker model, whereby somebody sits in the middle, the user verifies to the broker. The broker uses things like dates of birth certificates, legal court orders, passports to verify the individual and who the person acting as a parent is, and acts as the broker, and then feeds that to the service provider. Without either of them being in connection with each other until it's verified. So that's a possibility that might work. Watch this space.
Thank you, Robert. And last question, then we'll have closing remarks from Bob.
So the discussion has been about parental consent. There's two other flavors of laws which are mentioned in passing. One is age verification in regard to, quote, adult websites or adult content. And the other is the California age design thing that you guys that choice are challenging. So just speaking about the age verification, that's now gone to the Fifth Circuit. And in a lengthy decision, the Fifth Circuit ruled 2-1, I think Carl would say in the wrong way. And that was then bumped up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declined to get involved at this stage. So that's yet to be get properly to the Supreme Court. So to the two of you, I guess, your thoughts about the Fifth Circuit decision and where this may go.
So I would say it's early days, and one thing that both the majority and the dissent agree on is that the record is sparse. And so I would look for additional developments. As a first cut, it seems to in effect, confirm my general view that carefully crafted laws that address pressing social issues have a solid chance of being sustained as constitutional. And I think that this age verification, the age verification aspects anyway, of this law, I think may well meet that standard. But as I say, early days and more of a record. But both dissent and majority agree that the state has a strong, important interest in the well-being of minors. So that, I think, is a crucial thing to notice just how much the majority opinion and the dissent agree in that case.
I would say for those playing along at home, the law that we're talking about in this case is fundamentally different from every other law that we've discussed so far because it is talking about pornographic content. So that has historically been given a different approach when it comes to First Amendment speech. The age verification requirements in all the net choice cases are predicated on all speech, regardless of what it is. Something as simple as, "Hey Bob, how you doing?" Should be allowed, or reading the newspaper should be allowed. That's not really what was at stake in the Fifth Circuit case. So it is a decision, but it is a fundamentally different basis on which that law operates.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for the wonderful discussion. And so we'll have closing remarks, and how about Julia, and then Carl, Senator McKell, and then wrapping up with Robert from Europe and from San Francisco currently.
Now, I think I just said my major point, which is that, yes, there's a role for regulation in order to ensure the well-being of minors. And then if these regulations, if these laws are in fact carefully tailored to address serious problems, then I think that they will pass constitutional muster more often than not. But again, First Amendment doctrine is something of a mess and is in need of a cleanup. And I hope very much that we will see things get streamlined and clarified in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Julia.
So when it comes to First Amendment, strict scrutiny, least restrictive alternative. And here's a least restrictive law that is constitutional that we actually get to enjoy right now because we are in the state of Virginia. 2 states have enacted it. Several more are hopefully enacting it this year. The other is Florida that has also enacted this. What is it? Digital education is part of course curriculum. So much in the same way that we teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Virginia, and this is the first year this law has taken effect, so these students get to enjoy this. Digital literacy is now part of the course curriculum here in the great state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And what does that mean? Well, that means teachers have access to time and money to begin actually talking to students about social media usage, about actually talking to students about protecting your privacy and data security online. And that's one of the things that is missing in my state, for example, in Maryland, where teachers don't have this opportunity because it's not, quote, part of the school course curriculum. So that is a simple fix that every single state should at least try, regardless of whether you're going to do all this age gating and other crap. At least do that because A, it's constitutional, and we know a unconstitutional law protects 0 children. This, however, will protect every single child in the state of Virginia. And B, it just makes sense. So that's one of the things that we at NetChoice are going around doing, as well as educational campaigns. There are tons of tools out there for parents, and we need to do a better job of giving parents more information on the tools that they have, rather than trying to replace those parents with more government.
Thank you, Carl. Senator McKell?
Thank you. Hey, thank you for having me, George Mason University, the law school. It's been really good being out here. I came out here because this is an issue that I care about, and I care about it deeply. This is an issue that I think, we're rolling through Brooklyn right now, and we're a long ways from Central Park. The good news is I'm an attorney. I'm an AV-rated attorney as well. When we worked on our bill in Utah, we worked with a private firm. We worked with the attorneys in the governor's office, the attorney general's office, and our legislative attorneys as well. And obviously, they have a different opinion about the constitutionality of our bill. So we're going to get to see. But the one thing that I go back to is we have a serious problem that is not being addressed. And it's a bipartisan issue, and that's what's fun about it. There's blue state solutions, there are red state solutions. President Biden, I'm a Republican, and President Biden in his State of the State address, not this year, but the year before, talked about data collection and taking on big tech. And it's something that as policymakers, we're gonna continue to do that. And one of the things that I look forward to is seeing the Utah bill go through the process. What we did is it was a narrowly tailored bill. We identified with experts, some of the leading experts in the world, including the U.S. Surgeon General, what the compelling state interest is. And what I'd say to other lawmakers is don't be afraid, but make sure you identify that compelling state interest, have a bill that is narrowly tailored. And I loved your question before about the conflicts of law. I actually see that as a positive. This eventually does need to be solved through Congress. Unfortunately, I walked through the Capitol last night and I thought, wouldn't it be nice if Congress actually did things? We all agree social media is a problem, they don't fix it. We all agree the budget's an issue, we don't fix it. We all agree the border's an issue, we don't fix it. And because of that, that's why it's important for states to be involved, and I hope to see more action from more legislators across the country. Carl may not like it, but and he'll get to litigate more, but I hope to see more and more litigation.
Thank you, Senator McKell. And Robert, the perspective from the UK via San Francisco. Some closing remarks, please.
Sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. I just couldn't make the schedule work. So my fear is that in the rush to regulate, different decisions will be made in different countries, clearly different decisions will be made in different states. We're going to get these clashes. At least in the states, the federal government could weigh in at some point and harmonise. My fear is that that's not going to happen on a global basis, whatever, and there won't be global harmonization, and we'll end up being driven towards national regulation, which drives us to balkanization of the internet and little mini internets in each country, which could be regulated finely and differently from every other country, which will make it impossible for the global operators to work globally. And that'll be for the detriment to the whole world. I don't know what the answer to that is. There is no ability to harmonize legislation across the world. Europe can do it. America can do it. That's about it.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Julia, Carl, and Senator McKell. A fantastic discussion. So we're going to take a 5-minute break and then have the final panel, which is going to be fantastic also on data and data brokers.